Tonight what we want to focus on is what does it look like to address the future of Calgary from the perspective of recovering from what Strong Towns has termed the suburban experiment. What does it look like to be in a predicament where infrastructure bills continue to mount, where the struggles that we have to keep people connected, provide them with dignified paths through the community, whether on foot or on a bicycle or in a wheelchair or passing through in an automobile, providing lots of diverse ways for a community to thrive and to be prosperous is really at the core of what Strong Towns is all about. For those that are newly learning about what Strong Towns is, we're a nonprofit advocacy organization that primarily uses media in order to advance this message, that we need to change our development pattern. And so my son, he's 9, he just had his birthday the other day, and he said, "Dad, what are you doing?" And I said, well, what I'm doing is trying to change everything in North America in terms of what it looks like when you look out your bedroom window. What does it look like to drive on a street that has been made better for pedestrians? What does it look like to walk in a community that has been made better for someone to gather there? What does it mean to be able to gather in a place that has simultaneously been turned into a space much like our ancestors used to create spaces that were great for living? So that whether we are residing in a place, whether we are gathering in a place, whether we are moving in a place, or whether we are coming from one place to another, that we have the ability in these places to say, this place was made for me. I belong here, I'm valued here, and I have dignity. And the great challenge, the unaddressed challenge that is increasingly being addressed now, is that our current system of development has resulted in a way of stripping our communities of the core dignity that we should be providing to a broad range of residents within our community. This means that we have prioritized certain types of access to neighborhoods by means of the vehicle, as well as various types of access to neighborhoods in terms of income level, class level, the ability to borrow against one's assets that leave so many residents struggling to be able to find their way. Another challenge that Strong Towns addresses is the fact that we have an economic system that has managed through various types of restrictions to cut off the first several rungs of the ladder. Try to get a food truck started. Only recently has that been much more accessible, much more possible for somebody to have their shot at taking what they're good at in their home life and turning that into an opportunity to make some profit, to be able to get ahead, to be able to provide for themselves or for their family members or for their extended family as well. We see this also in the way in which many of our neighborhoods grapple with and really reject the idea of multi-generational living, which is not just a millennial living in his parents' basement, but is also a core feature of human habitat and human life for centuries, for millennia. And yet, because of suburban standards that were imposed upon us as a form of advertising, as a form of reaching a particular minority, or well, not so much a minority, but a particular section of society, that the consequence has been that many people are forbidden from doing the things that naturally we know is actually good for us. Staving off isolation, staving off the things that cause us to be disconnected from each other, providing resources within communities for seniors to be treated with deep respect by those whom they have given birth to, as well as their generations that follow. And so when I frame it that way, you'll understand then that my background is in the aspects of caring for people. It was mentioned that I was a pastor for 10 years, and this is what brought me to Strong Towns. The question is, how did our neighborhoods get to the point that it made it really easy for people not to know their neighbors? Driving in to your garage door as it lifts up, you enter your castle, you close your drawbridge, and you're not bothered by the neighbors who actually could be the ones that gave you the pound of butter, that gave you the assistance when you were in need, that lifted up your spirit when you kind of needed it, but also were a bit of a thorn in your side, not always that nice to be around, maybe had foods that you didn't especially appreciate when they were cooking, had kids that just wouldn't shut up, and yet that's part of what it is to live in community. That's part of what it is to be able to live together. And so my path to Strong Towns was very much around the question of how do we connect people back together? Because what I'm seeing around us, especially in the community I was pastoring in, was a community that was really dissected and bisected by two major strokes. That is the hybrid of trying to do the things that a street does, provide access and lots of opportunities for economic investment and shops and things like that, but most of the shops were closed. Most of the formerly good spots to hang out had been basically boarded up because there were no customers that were willing to pass through that area that had been degraded by the constant movement of tons of vehicles through it. And yet, we hadn't set aside those areas to simply be a highway or to be a major road. Instead, we were trying to do both. And if you've come across anything in the Strong Towns vernacular, you know that a strode is the futon of transportation. It's not a great bed, and it ain't a great couch. It tries to do both things at once and fails in both quite spectacularly. Now, what also began to emerge in my understanding, and this is where I think this allows us to cross over into many other areas of interest that perhaps touches on what you're interested in right now. Perhaps you don't care about your neighbors. I'm sure you do. But perhaps you're someone that just says, I need a city that works. And I'm concerned, as Nathan Howerlick at the back there has coined, if you're of a younger persuasion, you will know that it feels like we're right in the midst of an intergenerational dine and dash. We have our ancestors, our more recent generations, have rung up a significant infrastructure bill and left us with the responsibility to pay for it in perpetuity, or to simply begin to dismantle the things that we have in a mode of excess built, but do not have the funds to be able to provide for them. This is the challenge that we're facing, that the suburban experiment was a method of growing municipalities and communities rapidly, building out neighborhoods all at once into a finished state. And this is very different from the amoeba-like structures of our historic cities. I say amoeba because there's something organic of the emergence of different clusters of life, and then over time the emergence of deeper and more mature forms of life in those areas. And in contrast, the suburban experiment said we can skip all those messy steps. We can skip the shacks. We can skip the guy selling stuff off of a little table in the street. We won't allow that. This is perfect. That way we get exactly what we want. Our neighborhood's built out to a finished state, and then we can just leave it like that. And so the consequence is that Calgary, along with virtually every other municipality across North America, has gone all in on what we describe as a suburban experiment. They've gone all in. It's a big bet. And the consequence of it is that we have a ton of neighborhoods that, as Marone has started talking about it, are really stuck in an adolescent stage. They're frozen in amber, unable to develop, and consequently, much like we see in the way in which if you were stuck in a perpetual adolescence, you would never quite get to the point where you were immensely useful, immensely valuable in helping your community. We actually see many of these things in our communities as well. We have entire swaths of the city that are really difficult to provide good quality transit to because there's not the base of ridership, as well as the assumptions of what it means to use a bus or use a C-train, use different types of transportation. We find ourselves stuck in a stage where we're not permitting little emergences of retail to pop up in existing neighborhoods. Council members are certainly aware of the deep challenges that are faced within our neighborhoods when everything still seems to be quite frozen, and even efforts to introduce more and more infill are resisted and rejected. And yet, I am excited, and I think this is why the room is full, is because a big change is happening. And Strong Towns is a part of this process. We're not laying claim to all of it, although that would certainly help our membership recruitment strategies. But we do see that a groundswell of change is happening. Cities across Canada, the province of British Columbia stepping up and saying every lot is eligible for up to 4 properties, or up to 4 homes properly, I should be saying. In each of these places, Calgary is pressing ahead, new legislation that's just come out, strong support for these things, and hopefully one of the key things of the Strong Towns movement is to try to avoid some of the reactionary backlashes to the types of things that happen when a city says, we will begin to allow the next increment of development by right. We will begin to allow our neighborhoods to mature again. We will allow these pimply teenagers to grow up a bit and to flourish and to find their way. And in the consequence, or the version of that within the context of our cities, is for them to have more established structures, more intensive land uses, more housing within our core areas, rather than it being simply built out at the peripheries of town or only in the core of the community as well. And so things like sidewalks that are to be pleasant on, shop fronts that promote strolling, mingling, and sharing together, the potpourri of housing types to accommodate the neighborhood's residents no matter what stage of life they happen to be in. These are things that were normal in the traditional development pattern, normal in the way that our ancestors built cities, and yet we have now come to the place where, as I was looking at historical photos of the city of Delta, where I'm living now. I grew up in Lethbridge, by the way. I grew up on a dairy farm outside of Lethbridge in Coaldale, but grew up there, but now I live in Lethbridge, or in Delta, and I was trying to learn a little bit about the history of the place. And so I was looking at these pictures, and they had a boardwalk that was, the entire boardwalk went from here all the way to the end of the wall there. This like ample space for me, if I'd been old then, to be able to walk down, to be able to pass several wheelchairs lined up side by side, to be able to simply stand there for a while and not be pushed off to one side because I was taking up space on a sidewalk. Even things like, how did our sidewalks get to be so small? Began to emerge as a question, what have we lost? And what should we regain as we deepen our understanding of what it takes to build prosperous places? And so that's why the City of Calgary's planning professionals, elected officials, and residents like you all are facing these challenges together, and I'm confident you're doing your part to address them. But the suburban experiment, the small text says, for those that can't read it, entire neighborhoods built all at once to a finished state. This was the decision after World War II to turn every city across North America into an open air experiment, a mass experiment. Oh, there we go. A little bit better. The text is small, so get your eyes checked or move on up. No, you're good. But this experiment was and is an entirely new and radical departure from the way that we built our communities. This was a change from the millennia-long practices of building sustainable, resilient communities. And so the challenge that we have is that there has been 80 years of this type of development practice. And there's a big bill to pay for this. Nathan Howerlick, again, in his excellent blog post that he wrote for the Strongtown site, calculated, he said, to replace its $84.7 billion worth of public infrastructure. That is, assets that you, if you're a Calgary resident, aside from a man from Red Deer, that all you all are responsible for. And that all of you all have committed to, in one way or another, participating in the process of maintaining these things and using them for the public good. Now, to replace $84.7 billion dollars of infrastructure, the City of Calgary should be collecting, if you think of what it would take to simply be in the regular habit of replacing, renewing, rehabilitating these things, about $2.98 billion each year. And that's just to cover infrastructure.
With inflation, it's $3.6 billion.
Well, thanks for making it even worse. Turns out we should have done this last year, and then it would have been a little bit cheaper. But along the way, the challenges, I mean, as city council members know, and as those that read city budgets to fall asleep know, there are so many other things that the city is obligated by provincial mandate or desires to provide to its residents, and that's without this added burden of repairing and replacing these things. And so at Strongtowns, we say, either you need really intensive tax increases, or you need drastic cuts in service, which is the point where I end and people throw things at me, or you change your development pattern. And this is part of that process. It is necessary, it is obligatory, and it is happening. We're beginning to see the seeds of this change happening, and it is critical to see this take place. Now, briefly, I want to just touch, actually, I was a pastor, so every time I say brief, it's just my way of apologizing for running long. But I won't go too long tonight. But I do want to just briefly say, what is a traditional development pattern? It runs the risk of being jargon or a lingo for you. A traditional development pattern was based off an assembly of neighborhoods. And you can go and search and study historical neighborhoods all around us. And each neighborhood would be its own independent unit, largely because it was built around the size and speed and scale of the person on foot. Which meant by the time that they reached the exhaustion point of having gone about 30 minutes carrying things, there would be great opportunity if you were an up-and-coming shopkeeper, if you were an entrepreneur, you would say, I know where to put my things. I'm going to start building right here, and now I've got a pool of people that I can begin to attract. And so that's where you would see in the traditional development pattern, there would always be the emergence of more or less complete neighborhoods. And as they would mature, the traditional development pattern would always see this, that the building that was in the poorest repair would be upgraded, would be sometimes torn down, sometimes burned down, which, I mean, we don't need to advocate for more city fires, but at the same time, they did have an enlivening effect, allowing for the emergence of a higher order of land use. And this happened with housing, You would have a single family home, or what was considered now is considered a single family home. But if Uncle Steve moved in, you built him an extra little lean-to because you didn't want him to be around the kids. Because he was a drunk, that's why. You also had a situation where Uncle Steve needed to get a job, so you said, hey, we're going to build you a little shed in the backyard. That's where you can do your work, because we don't want your paint solvents in our neighborhood, or in our living room, rather. You would see the emergence of these things. You would also have somebody else that would say, hey, I will buy your house from you, and I'm going to build a rooming house here and provide the opportunity for you to move back in, as well as people that are passing through the community, the early version of Airbnb or hotels, and provide the opportunity for us to provide housing in these places. And so what we had was these neighborhoods that were still accessible within a 15-minute walk. And for those worried about being locked in a 15-minute neighborhood, don't worry, rest assured, because one of the things I was thinking, 15-minute cities has had its moment, and some folks that are concerned about it. And for those that are really worried about it, I always say the more that you advocate for traditional development patterns to become commonplace in our cities and towns, the more that you'll come to experience a lot of the freedoms that come from a time when there was less government. A time when there was less imposition on your rights and privileges and Second Amendment credentials and things like this. But the reality is the more that we have this, the more we come to experience a lot of these freedoms that come from building great places to live, that you'll be free to leave, but won't ever feel the need to. This is where I think the most simple way to address the question of 15-minute cities and the concern, rightly, of creating prison cities is to say that we should just do what we used to do. Build 15-minute cities because that was the best type of development pattern for our communities to work together in. To have more neighborhoods come together to form a city. To be able to travel from neighborhood to neighborhood, city to city, but for each to be their own fully functional unit. This is where community schools were very normal. And now they've become an endangered species. Why? Because in our quest to rationalize and in our quest to make more efficient and in our quest to conform with the standards and norms of the suburban experiment where everything has to be at a higher standard without a deep emergence of those standards within the community, the trouble becomes then that we discard, we remove the things that used to make our neighborhoods fantastic. Parks that were tended by actual gardeners that had great pride in the things that they were doing. And now our park staff are required to get on ever bigger mowers in order to do ever more lawn mowing and neglect many of the other areas in order to keep up, because budget cuts keep pulling back the things that they're able to do. And so if we think of the traditional development pattern, and once you, again, this is a little bit tricky, but on the left, it's got a bunch of names on it, and it is from, this is an amazing graphic that Sadiq Mohideen on his blog put together. And it's the light rail services that existed in Calgary in 1945. So on the right here, this little map actually shows where all of the different lines are as they become a little bit sharper there. I can show you this afterwards, especially for those at the back. But what he was showing was that this was the way that all of the different light rail and streetcars and trams and different elements of Calgary's history were networked together in order to serve all of these different, notice, named clusters. All of these core neighborhoods, these little neighborhoods that still live on, sometimes in memory, other times in reality, even today, all were served by transit because that just made sense for a community to do that. Now, here in this, again, this is going to be a little challenging at the back. This is what that represents. For 1945, the population was 98,000 at that time. Since that time, for the last 78 years, Calgary's added about 20,000 new residents, and Calgary has gotten a lot bigger. Calgary has continued to grow, and that would be expected. But the scale and the scope of the growth is the concern, because it has resulted in the lack of intensification of many of the existing neighborhoods when they were frozen or either otherwise neglected, resulting in massive investments being poured into highways that removed people from these neighborhoods rather than having them invest in these core areas. We had massive roads and stroads and lots of stressed streets. All of the intense infrastructure requirements to service lower population densities. And so it resulted in something like an inverse donut, with more intensive land use in cluster communities now at the periphery of the city, while not having that filter through into the more established neighborhoods between the periphery and the core. which is why, for example, as members of either this council or previous ones try to sort out how do we route our LRTs to work in a way that actually meets up with different population nodes. That work and that math is extremely difficult because it has to bypass large areas that don't have the sufficient population density to justify the levels of service, and so the trains pass through in order to go on further to service commuters at the edges of the community, which incidentally, as we were driving in here from Cochrane, results in somebody being able to live in Cochrane and then drive in 30 minutes and then hop on the train and make their way in, continuing to contribute to the challenges that we have. Now, that's why I like the way that this event was described, because it's a good time for this discussion to take place in the community. As Nathan and others here with Strong Towns Calgary are calling for a philosophy of bottom-up community building. A bottom-up community building looks like neighborhoods saying, like, we are okay with change. We recognize that if we don't allow the types of changes that we're seeing in our community, our places are only going to become more exclusive and expensive. One of the great arguments to make is that if your kids can't afford to live here, maybe your neighborhood isn't so great. Maybe you can be part of beginning to build in the changes that are necessary to allow lots of different generations at lots of different income levels to live within your existing neighborhoods. But we want this to be in a bottom-up way, removing many of the barricades and barriers in our zoning bylaws and many of our other practices in order to allow this emergence out of this state of being frozen back into a state of being resilient and active and dynamic and responsive, often to the earliest indications of need, rather than, and I'll say this as somebody living in Vancouver with our crazy housing prices, we've only belatedly begun to respond to needs that have been suppressed for a couple of decades, allowing a machine of building out housing to begin to slow in our core existing areas where all of our services were, now leaving us with the situation where you can't buy anything that is worth living in for less than $1.3 million for a single family home, and struggling to even have a chance to bid on townhouses and other condos and other types of housing because there's such a scarcity of those things. Calgary's facing the same challenge. And yet, here we are in a place like this where we face housing needs and infrastructure needs. And as you can see in this, as some will be able to see in the front rows, one of the big things is, and this is the core to the argument for more infill development or neighborhood investment, is that you can add many more participants in the work of paying for essential services that are needed within the community. To add more, to be able to contribute a portion of what you have, a portion of your own value, a portion of your own resources for the upkeep and the upbuilding of your neighborhoods around you. And so who is it, and one of the things that we should consider is that this is part of the predicament that we're in. This isn't all good news, as Nathan was saying, that the infrastructure bill keeps getting higher, but there's also an intractable trap that we've gotten ourselves into with respect to housing. This will be familiar to you. That if we ask the question, well, who is it that benefits from high house prices? We know that local governments certainly have. Provincial governments on land transfer taxes have made off like bandits with it. The provincial government in BC was especially irresponsible in this way, depending so extensively on this revenue stream. And why not? It's great money. It works well as the population continues to move between homes, continues to have all of these types of transactions always going up and up and up. We have the federal government enjoying many of the privileges that come from high house prices. Existing homeowners. Some of you all, and this is when like the class warrior in me comes out, so I'll be generous and careful. But as a renter, I'm like, hey, I don't want my dad's investment to suddenly collapse, even as I pray half the time for it to collapse. Yet at the other half, I've got brothers, I've got sisters, I've got family members, I've got loved ones. We have people that are betting big on the income of, or the expectation that their equity will not go down. People that are hanging on by a thread and yet reliant on existing housing high prices staying considerably higher. We have banks and insurance companies in on it. Many of the same banks and insurance companies that said for the longest time the market simply doesn't want townhouses. The market simply doesn't want apartments. The market simply doesn't want anything aside from the thing that we're building out at the edges of the community. And so the consequence is that was all that was able to be built until belatedly the realization came, we're in trouble. We need to find ways to build something else and quickly, which is going to be one of the challenges that as a Strong Towns advocate, I always grapple with, because the question is, how are we going to make sure that we don't simply in our quest to do everything quickly, cause a further deepening of the ruptures that are building within our communities. We're seeing the challenge, and trust me, I'm a yes in my backyard person all the way through, and yet one of the frustrating things is that the introduction of far more supply into our housing establishment is really not yet making the dent that we expect it to. And in part because we're trying to head off the type of housing collapse that can happen, for example, in reverse with the price of used cars. When all of a sudden there was a shortage of new cars, the price of used cars went way up. But now it's starting to come back down, which is fine on a $2,000 or $3,000 or $4,000 investment. But there is nobody that wants the same thing to be happening with existing investments. Land speculators, realtors, pension funds. And so all of these are benefiting in a sense, you could say it's a benign conspiracy to contribute together to the continued increase of housing prices. Now, who doesn't? A growing group of renters and the poor. And this group is growing. And I mentioned I was a class warrior at times. I also know where to find pitchforks. And this is the trouble, that we can get ourselves into deep structural inequities within our existing communities that result in either real violence or real distress within our political systems. These systems are beginning to buckle, they're beginning to bind, and the struggles are getting more and more intense. And the challenge is, how can we assert that there needs to be change in every neighborhood, that no neighborhood should be exempt from change, while also pleading with our leaders to say, let's make sure that no neighborhood is subject to radical change, completely changed. Because when we do this, when we say that we can put more and more of our homes within our existing neighborhoods where our services already exist, that we can make a significant change in our practices. Now, there are a lot of deeper dysfunctions in our land use practices, but I'm going to go into something that really touches on this dysfunction illustrated in, again, I'll read out the numbers here, but this is on 17th Avenue Southwest, the Socality coffee shop, although Google Maps said it might be closed. If so, that's too bad. It's probably being redeveloped. But this property was assessed at $897,000 and occupies a 0.7 acre site. All right, thanks, Norm. Thanks for telling me that. But if we take that and using something similar to the miles per gallon that we buy our vehicles in, or assess our vehicles in, at least in terms of how efficient they are, when we want to compare one property to another, one property that's 7 acres and another that's 0.7 acres, we can ask the question, how much value is stored in that particular place? And to have a like-for-like measure, the best thing to do is divide it by the acreage so that way you get this calculation of $12.8 million an acre. There's nothing remarkable about this building. Part of it is its location. But immediately next to it, with a slightly more intense land use, you actually see a $3 million increase in its value per acre. Now, these buildings are largely the same. The one is just, you can see Cobb's Bread is just 2 doors down. These buildings are largely the same, but just a modest change, a modest emergence of the next level of intensity of this type of building results in considerably more value being stored in a place. And why does that matter? Because when there's value stored in a place, then the person that owns it is willing to pay just a little bit more, or a percentage, a fraction of what the whole value is, to be able to provide for public services, to be able to be taxed and not gripe about it, or gripe about it but not actually take out pitchforks, to be able to provide out of a well or out of a reservoir a fraction of that for the community good, for a community investment, for the things that we share in common together. And thank God that we have these things. Police, fire, all of the different services that we benefit from. And so if you think of this reservoir that every property in the city, imagine, or these are just right next to each other. So you could average it out, 12.8, 15.4. So let's say it's averaged at $14 million an acre. Well, right next door, just across the street from the previous building, is a $29 million building. It occupies a larger site of 0.68 acres. And so the average or the value per acre is $43.5 million an acre. And you can't see it, but it's a Best Buy. So it's something that is naturally an inhabitant of big box world, and yet has the ability to be adapted into the urban form and actually perform quite admirably. Somebody's washing the windows, so clearly it's not fallen into disrepair. That would be my mother's standard of whether or not a place has fallen into disrepair. Are the windows clean? And so this place is clearly doing well. Now, just a little ways further up this into the Killarney neighborhood is a much older building. But notice the way in which it's clustered. It's somewhat close to the street. It does have some front parking, which causes some challenges in our urban form of degrading the experience of walking by it on the sidewalk. But even still, an $899,000 building on a 0.08 acre site yields a value of $11.2 million an acre. But in contrast to this site, that is I can't do math, 6 times larger, no, whatever 0.68 versus 0.08 is, which of these two allows for a new business owner to get their start in a rental or even to become a property owner? Which of these two is more likely to provide somebody with a pathway into business ownership, into providing for themselves and for their next generation? Well, it's these smaller lots, these smaller parcels that have this capacity, and yet, critically for the city, hold a deep amount of stored wealth within them, especially when you add up all of the parcels nearby to fill up the same site. Now, just a little ways further up 17th Avenue, we come to the Resorts of the Canadian Rockies office space. Now we're beginning to move into the world of suburban development patterns. This isn't that far from the downtown. It's still well serviced by transit and other services that the city regularly provides. But notice all of a sudden what's happening is that the well or the reservoir is shrinking. $7.9 million per acre on this site. That's a 0.34 acre site. Now, this was all the way out at the outskirts of the city in the northeast. I thought this was quite interesting. Because in contrast, this one is way closer to the downtown, way closer to established services, way closer to the things that the city has collectively provided, and yet it's only marginally more productive, has an only barely discernibly deeper well to provide for those services compared to this site. This is a new build, but it's being built in a more urbanist style. And it's assessed at $9.3 million on a 1.29 acre site. Probably if you could knock down some of the parking requirements, that site could have been used even more intensively and benefited the neighborhoods even more fully. But here we're starting to see that as the work of building more complete neighborhoods, even at the fringe or the edge of the community, as that happens, you can actually do the things that build wealth in a place and provide that reservoir to provide neighborhood services. But a little ways further to the south, actually all the way on the other side of the city in the southwest, you have a brand new power center. Brand new. This is the state that it was, actually the picture doesn't show, but now it is fully open on the day that it was assessed. $51.3 million. You say, Norm, that's the most valuable property you've shown me. Well, yes, but it occupies 11.4 acres, which means that the city has said we will allocate, by right of the property owner, 11 acres to this use and only 0.08 acres to this use, and yet this one returns half what the other one did. Here's the Walmart on McLeod Trail, and notice this is a 27 million acre site, but on 8.5 acres, down to $3.2 million an acre. Vastly underperforming the capacity of the small, the woe-begotten Luke's drugstore, little Socality Coffee, all of these other places that have this deep reservoir. Here, we're running skid. We're causing troubles for ourselves. Car dealerships up by the airport. $3.8 million an acre. Well, and I meant to have a slide in for the previous one where it's at McLeod and Southlands. Major public investments in all of the roadways, all of the services that are provided there, and yet a fraction of the value-producing capacity that these other sites have. Here, similarly, with this massive auto dealership, massive investments of public funds providing direct benefit to the immediately adjacent neighborhoods, or immediately adjacent properties, I should say. These dealerships are sited there for a reason, because they need the access the roads are providing them, and yet are not paying for it in the ability that they have to provide on a per acre basis the amount of tax revenue that all of the other sites are doing. Another brand new on Stonehill Drive up by the airport, $2.9 million an acre. Now, you might be saying, hey, Norm, the reason why this one is at 12.8 is just because of its development potential, just because you can build something there. Well, what struck me is that in comparison with this $2.9 million an acre, or this one at $3.8 million an acre, we were just in Cochrane. This is Cochrane, which is a long ways away and doesn't have the development potential that Calgary does. Is not close to the downtown, is much further away than the airport is. And yet this OK Tire puts the brand new BMW and the other shops, puts it in the tailpipe by saying is worth $4.0 million an acre. And that's with a sizable parking lot there at the back. This is also the Rocky Mountain Brewing, $6.4 million an acre. So that the moment that we return back to these types of traditional neighborhoods and these types of traditional development patterns, we see the wealth stored there, the reservoir of wealth providing for the ability to provide for local community services increase again. It's not rocket science. It's the things that our ancestors did before rockets were invented. It's the things that allowed our ancestors to build places that didn't just wither away and die. It allowed our ancestors to build places with modest use of scarce resources over a sustained period of time while allowing incremental investment to gradually build the reservoir from which the community could then add additional services, add additional public luxuries. The class warrior in me again comes out when I read George Monbiot, who's written about the need for public luxuries and private sufficiency, and that we can enjoy these. CBC Ideas has an amazing interview with him. Sidetrack, but just bear with me. The idea of being able to generate public luxuries in a way that benefits us all. And so what do we learn from the example here in Cochrane? Cochrane's a long ways away. It's a lovely little town, but it doesn't have the economic generation capacity that Calgary does. And yet its small parcels, built in a more traditional style, notice this is a one-story building, outperforming the brand new shiny thing that required all of that public investment. That sits there and prevents other types of investments, other types of new clusters of neighborhood cores from emerging in these places. This type of investment is causing our communities to deeply struggle and suffer. And so there are often well-intended top-down policy interventions. Let's separate out uses. Let's regulate away nuisance. Let's designate which is the wealthy neighborhood and which is the poor neighborhood. And it's resulted in an impoverishing of us all. The deliberate physical separation of income-producing spaces from residences and recreation spaces. And maybe just to touch on that briefly. One of the things, this is for council in particular, but so many others need to advocate for these things to even get onto the agenda of council and the consideration of city staff. But what does it look like for our homes, which are difficult to afford in our current climate, or difficult to rent? What does it mean for these homes to be income producing? Working from home has that effect. But when we think of things like Airbnb, that is one of the methods by which many people on the lower end of the economic spectrum are able to actually rent out a bedroom to either a student or to a traveler and be able to provide a modicum of a modicum of income to the household there. If we lose the idea that your home is just where you live and recreate, and then you go away in order to create your wealth, what if we actually learn from our ancestors and realize that many of our ancestors had market gardens in their front yard and backyard, raised some chickens that were a bit too noisy, and yet did so in order to supplement their income, help them to stay in their place? What does it look like for every garage to be eligible immediately for a home-based business? And not without a long hassle, not without having to convince the neighbors. What about if backyards are places that can become beef jerky manufacturing locations on a small scale? Allowing for the ability to regulate against nuisances if it's causing people's eyes to water, like the sriracha plant in California. You got to do something about that. Look it up. It's a great story. Well, great, not for those people that live there, but it was fascinating. The unintended consequences of large industrial uses. But I'm talking about just stuff that is subsistence, allowing communities to be able to do these types of things. Because the challenge that we have is, as we say at Strong Towns, we need more Jane Jacobs and less Robert Moses. Robert Moses was the man that used many different tools of power in order to impose a vision upon New York City and other places. Buffalo, where I lived just outside of Buffalo in St. Catharines, Ontario, Buffalo has some beautiful parks that have been blasted through with highways because of Robert Moses and his desire to simply make things happen. Instead, what we need is Jane Jacobs' style of standing back saying, let's allow things to emerge. Let's see what occurs. Let's consider the unintended but possibly brilliant things that people can do with their own time, resources, and money. And so, actually, I'm going to skip through this. This is part of our presentation often. But I'm just briefly going to introduce you to the ideas of Strong Towns as a way of concluding our talk tonight. The first is that financial solvency is a prerequisite for long-term prosperity. Your community, Nathan's not alone in raising the alarm bell. You've got massive infrastructure needs, and you're going to have to find ways to pay for them. And that help from the federal government is increasingly going to be scarce because of rising interest rates and borrowing obligations, as well as from the provincial government. And so the challenge is you need to create the things like what I was talking about in the value per acre section to allow for a deeper reservoir from which local needs can be supplied by local resources. The goal of the city is to endure, and to do that, they have to be solvent. At minimum, this means having more assets than liabilities and an ability to pay our debts. We need to do the math on every proposed development. What are the short-term costs now, and what will we be paying to maintain or replace for generations to come? Now, second commitment that we make is that land is the base resource for community prosperity, and it must not be squandered. This is one of the ways in which Strong Towns advocates have those moments where they say, once I've seen the squandering of land, the carelessness with which we make use of a scarce and limited resource, it's hard to unsee it. And I would challenge you to look around and see the ways in which we don't allow many of our places to become flourishing and thriving. The activity taking place on a city's land must be creating enough wealth to support the infrastructure and services needed for that place to continue to exist and thrive. Now, this is another important one, that transportation systems are a means of creating prosperity and not an end. Which means that we can't use fanciful numbers to generate our return on investment. Instead, we need the practical ones. And sometimes we take steps to do pilot projects, to slowly implement different types of infrastructure improvements, to allow people to walk, to allow people to cycle, to do the things often by means of carving just a little more space out of the roadway from the exclusive use of automobiles to reorient them. If you have 12-foot travel lanes or 11-foot travel lanes, they can be 9. Maybe 10. And you do that, all of a sudden you're reclaiming a considerable amount of space. And here, maybe just for a moment, this is one of the things, again, as advocates, you can press the city to become more nimble at this is that we make unplanned modifications of our streets all the time. When a car breaks down, a pylon goes in place so that nobody slams into its back end. When there's a pipe that's broken, all of a sudden we make an unplanned modification of the street. When we have a parade, that's a planned modification, but we use all sorts of temporary things. Well, we can be doing this on a wide scale with pylons, with planters, with paint. Although don't use paint because most of the time it doesn't stop cars. Actually, it doesn't ever stop cars. And so use things that will stand in the way and allow ourselves to reallocate the way that we use our space and consider what is the connection with the private realm, private properties that are immediately adjacent. As Edward and I were walking through the downtown, we said, there's some wonderful things that are happening in the public streetscape, and yet private landowners are not being prompted to cut in new doorways, to provide new gathering spaces that then enter into these buildings. We continue to see blank walls, although thankfully design standards are changing in that regard. But all of this has a lot to do with the things that allow people to make choices about their transportation rather than being driven into one path and one path alone. Briefly here, job creation and growth are the result of a healthy local economy and are not substitutes for one. We have observed this pattern of touting job numbers as the primary and sole and only necessary justification for a project to proceed, especially in the States. As Canadians, I can say we don't ever succumb to that bug. But when I was in the minister's office in Ottawa, we had all kinds of shovel-ready projects that went out the door to keep people employed. And Chuck Marone from Strong Towns always said, a shovel-ready project is just a project that nobody wanted to pay for until somebody else did. And so those are the types of things that we criticize and warn against, to not chase smokestacks, to not pursue massive, large investments, opening up big doors while refusing to open up the many, many small doors that would allow the creative ecosystem of small-scale development, small-scale entrepreneurs, income-producing households in their actual homes, all of these types of things. We need this to work in our favor. But then another key part of this, and this is where it's exciting to see a room like this, it's exciting to build together, is that strong places cannot happen without strong citizens. You can have an amazing staff, and we have a great deal of respect for the staff and the stories that we're hearing out of the city of Calgary. You have a council that, I can say this as an outsider, you can have your own views, but I'm impressed. I'm excited. Ask Nathan. I said, I think you guys got a great counselor. But that gives you an obligation as members of the community to support the good that you want to see. It is so much easier to bellyache and whine and oppose the things that get your heart rate racing. And I know a lot of people that are very good at that. But it takes a lot more effort and will to get out and go and show up in support of something. And yet to be in support of something is actually to be participating in seeing a good vision enacted. Always be for something, not just against some things. Be for a good and prosperous life in a growing and build a stronger community. And so we need our strong citizens. Lastly, this is just a plea. We as an organization are so focused on bottom-up change. And we believe that this is one of the primary ways that we're going to see a big paradigm shift take place. But in order for that to happen, we actually feel like most of our efforts should be focused at the local level. For every national issue that you care about deeply, there's a local analog that is crying out for your attention. And so one of the challenges and the encouragements is to go out and take that on, tackle that project, and do so together. Because the challenge that we have is that our current path, meant as a means of securing prosperity for all, has unwittingly trapped us in a system that is incapable of building lasting prosperity, and therefore we must change it. But we can do so. And I would say that the traditional development pattern offers a reliable path to freedom from the trouble that we've gotten into. And it's not just that we're saying, oh, let's go back to the days of horse-drawn carts. But let's go back to the days when people walked on foot. Oh wait, that's still something we can do, and something that we do well, and something that we do increasingly in resorts and other places when we travel overseas, and yet struggle to see implemented in our own community. But that is changing, and that's really exciting. Again, this is something the city of Calgary is doing, allowing the next increment by right, allowing household or neighborhoods to emerge. Legalize small, just make it happen. Critically, we often think of legalizing small and accessory dwelling units or cottage courts or things like this, often from the perspective of allowing people to purchase or rent at prices that are better for them. But I also think a secondary benefit of it is that way more hands are taken off the sidelines and put into action, where day laborers become contractors that are building small projects that they can take to the bank and get funding for. That day laborers are doing things in their evenings to be able to build an extra structure, to be able to do something with a property. And when we put barriers in the way to that, while simultaneously allowing every master plan community an easy path because we need more housing, the challenge is that we limit ourselves, and our current construction practices are nearly at their max. Or you talk to most people in the building trades, they're not standing around idle, which means that we need to unleash a new generation, a whole new crew of people that are doing small projects on their own or with a partner. And the only way to make that happen is within existing neighborhoods and at the smallest level possible, allowing for the building up and the thickening up of our neighborhoods. Again, I mentioned this, but make laws that address nuisances, not uses. Zoning bylaws have been used to try to address nuisances. It's not a good way to do it. It's a really bad hammer. We still need bylaw officers. And so clearly we haven't solved the problems that we wanted to address through zoning, particularly the racially tinged zoning bylaws that were intended to address the nuisance of the wrong kind of people. We've learned that is, one, abhorrent, but also that one of the consequences of our zoning practices that we must, not to get too theological, almost atone for, but also strive to never address it in this way again. And the apartment ban, learn the fine art of unleashing greater financial productivity. That's just like a teaser. That's a whole other talk that we could give. Check out the Strongtown site on unleashing greater financial productivity. Guess where the downtown of this map is? It's where all of the actual value is being produced and created in the town of Bothell, Washington, where the core needs of the community are being met. And so this is, I'll wrap here because I'm aware that I've probably gone way over. Not too bad. Not too bad. But we've got some time, and then we're going to go out for a walking tour. And so I just want to say thank you so much for being attentive, being here tonight, putting up with some of our foibles at the beginning, but also taking an opportunity to really give thought to this, because as you do so, I am excited to see what Strongtowns Calgary as an organization does, but also the ways in which Calgary will increasingly become a strong town. So thank you so much. Woo!